coming, and thank you for all of the interest. We've had so many people interested, which is really great, and we're happy that you're as passionate as us about the event. We have a Slido for questions, so if you go type in your questions there, we'll answer them at the end, and also upvote the ones that you're interested in hearing the answer to. We will first have a little talk about the UCL mental health services from Martin. So,
just a quick shout out, as you are all obviously interested in mental health. UCL currently has a campaign called the Fund Our Mental Health Services, and it's currently got 2,000 signatures on a petition that's going around. Every year UCL uptakes more and more people, and the funding for mental health just does not match this. Currently, the waiting time for to get mental health services can be 6 weeks or more. We have a demonstration on campus at the 6th of December. Like our Facebook page, join the campaign. It's called UCL Fund Our Mental Health, and action and stuff. Enjoy.
Okay, so our first speaker of the day is Akeela Ahmed. So Akeela Ahmed has been an equalities activist and campaigner for nearly 20 years. On Muslim Women's Day, she was listed in Nylon magazine as an activist that is making a difference, and in 2014 she founded She Speaks, We Hear, which gives an unfiltered platform to women's voices. Akeela advises and works with government in tackling anti-Muslim hatred, sitting on the Anti-Muslim Hatred Working Group. She's also a social entrepreneur with the social housing sector and a full-time director of a homelessness organization that she set up in 2014. In January 2017, Akeela spoke to over 100,000 people at the Women's March in London, and she is a trustee for the Muslim-Jewish Women's Network, Nisa Nashim, and regularly appears in media. So please give a warm welcome to Akeela Ahmed.
Good evening, everybody, and I'm really pleased to be here, especially as I used to go to UCL as a student many years ago, and it's really changed now actually, and I got lost on my way here to moving. But I'm here to talk to you today about Christian Muslim women and mental health, and I'll be specifically looking at how Muslim women's voices are treated in different aspects of their lives in different areas. So just to give you a brief overview, I'll first talk about a client I adopted whilst I was Muslim Youth Helpline. And then I will talk a little bit about how Muslim women's voices are silenced. Is it? Okay. Is that better? Is it on? Or?
Yeah, it's definitely on. I think maybe you can just hold it.
I hold it, okay.
Easy.
Is that better? Okay. So I'll go through a case study. I will look at how Muslim women's voices within their own communities and families are silenced. I will then look at how Muslim women are perceived and discussed within public discourse. And I'll touch on the intersectionality of barriers and oppressions that Muslim women face in their daily lives. And then finally, I'll touch on the impact this has on their mental health and well-being. So, whilst I was at the Muslim Youth Helpline, we were contacted by a young girl whose name I've changed. I'll call her Sophie. And she basically presented to us with bipolar disorder. Now, Sophie, as a young child, she had experienced sexual abuse, and she didn't tell anybody about it. And then when she did, she told her family, and they didn't believe her. They swept it under the carpet. This really impacted her. Apart from having dealt with the abuse itself, she then had another trauma of not being believed by her close family. And as Sophie grew up and developed into a teenager, she started to experience sort of PTSD type symptoms, and she started to play truant from school. She started to take drugs, alcohol, and basically her life started to fall apart, and she started to become very, very ill. At that time, nobody picked up on just how ill she was. You know, her school thought she was a problematic child. Her family just thought she wasn't, you know, behaving very well. And she wasn't picked up by mental health services. When she got in touch with us, she had basically contacted us because the mental health services had told her that if she doesn't voluntarily admit herself to hospital for psychiatric care, then they'll have to section her. But her family still were a barrier. They didn't want her to go into hospital for care. They didn't want her to receive the treatment she'd been offered because they said that she was Muslim, and Muslims don't, and predominantly South Asian, she was South Asian, and that basically Muslims and predominantly South Asian communities don't suffer from mental health issues, and that if they, you know, if anybody found out about it, then it would, you know, hamper her prospects of getting married and being able to kind of move in the community, and she'd be stigmatized, and her family would be stigmatized. Now, the reason that I chose Sophie's case study, because I felt that it's a useful example of that young Muslim girls and Muslim women do experience sexual violence, and there is a myth, I think, because of recent sort of grooming cases and other sort of cases, that actually young Muslims and Muslim women do not experience sexual violence. And I'll touch a little bit on this again later. But also, I think it's a good example of how, as a woman, as a young girl, she was, you know, it's an example of how, you know, she was silenced. She was silenced by her family. First, she was, you know, attacked and abused, and then when she tried to talk about it, she was silenced by her family. And then the structures around her, which should have picked up on what she was going through, her school, her GP, whatever, they also failed her. They didn't pick up on it either. So again, in a way, she was silenced. So how are Muslim women's voices systematically silenced within their own communities? Well, it's still a struggle in many ways for Muslim women to have meaningful representation in mosques and community organizations. This is not across the board. There are some very, very good examples of best practice, but unfortunately that's not the norm. Religion is used by some to marginalize the needs and the voices of Muslim women, and, you know, the mosque example is a good one, where actually there will be some who will say it's, you know, from a religious perspective, it's better for women to stay at home rather than going to the mosque. So that's an area where religion is used to not meet the needs of Muslim women. Violence against women and girls is experienced by Muslim women across, you know, across the globe in the same way that any other woman, you know, may face violence, including sexual violence. But again, I think within their own communities, it's misunderstood. There isn't that much awareness of domestic violence, of sexual violence, and therefore there isn't the support structures within those communities for women to get help, or if there are, then they're few and far between. And then finally, there is a stigma around mental illness, as in Sophie's case, and still mental health issues aren't discussed as much as they should be. There is a lack of awareness, and often it means that if women are experiencing mental health issues, then they're sort of getting help at a crisis point rather than sort of much earlier. So now looking at the sort of wider public sphere and the way that Muslim women are viewed. ENA did some research last year, and they basically found that Muslim women within the media are perceived in this kind of binary, where there is basically this stereotypical representation of Muslim women as either being a threat and dangerous, or as being oppressed. And I've just sort of pulled out a couple of images from the media. Most recently, Peter Hitchens did an article in response to the sexual harassment allegations that have been coming out in Hollywood and in Parliament. And his response was that women shouldn't raise the issue of sexual harassment because they'll end up wearing a niqab. And this is just so awful on so many levels because A, it assumes that Muslim women or women who wear a niqab do not experience sexual violence. B, it, you know, in his world, Muslim women are the butt end of a joke, basically. You know, if you wear a niqab, you're a joke and you're something to be feared, and it's like the worst thing that could possibly happen, even worse than experiencing sexual assault. So absolutely awful. I've included the image of a French woman who was wearing a bikini, I think sometime last year, and she was at gunpoint forced to remove her bikini because bikini was deemed to be dangerous. And then there's some other sort of depictions from European media of Muslim women. So Muslim women are stereotyped in the media, and I would say actually they're sort of the most spoken about group within the media. There isn't a day where I don't sort of log on to Twitter or Facebook and see some sort of story about Muslim women, and more often than not it's negative. But actually I very rarely hear from genuine voices of Muslim women. And if I do hear from Muslim women in the media, then it's often talking about extremism or talking about, you know, countering, you know, FGM, for example, and often, you know, their voices can be co-opted or instrumentalized. It's very rare that I hear a Muslim woman talk on her own terms in a sort of genuine platform. So that, you know, that's the sort of barrier that Muslim women face within the public sphere, and then there are also further barriers that Muslim women face around employment and education. And Demos reported that Muslim women face significant barriers in the recruitment processes, and again this is because of the stereotype threat which is fed by the media. Educated Muslim women were less likely to be employed compared to an educated non-Muslim woman, and this is further compounded if women are wearing hijab or a niqab, they're visibly identifiably as Muslim, then they're likely to face barriers at the interview stage of recruitment or later on in the workplace. Tal Mama has done some research on anti-Muslim hatred and its nature, and focusing on sort of online abuse and street hate crime, and they have just recently reported that anti-Muslim hate crime is gendered, which basically means that if you're a Muslim woman, you're more than likely to, if people who experience anti-Muslim hatred are more likely to be women, and it's more likely to be perpetrated by a white man. And Tell Mama, you know, further report that, you know, this type of harassment and abuse takes place not only on the street but also in the virtual world as well. And the University of Cambridge also reports that non-white Muslim women appear far more likely to suffer discrimination on the street than their female non-Muslim counterparts. And the University of Cambridge also included everyday sort of microaggressions. So this is sort of, you know, waiting at a bus stop and the bus not stopping for you because you're visibly Muslim, or going to a shop and not being served even though you've been in the queue, that sort of thing. And Dr. Imran Awan and Dr. Irene Zempi, they did some research speaking to Muslim women who've experienced hate crime, and looking at the psychological and emotional sort of impact of that. And they found that, you know, women who'd suffered hate crime were more likely to experience it more than once, and this had an impact on their self-confidence. It led them to feel depressed, anxious, isolated, and it had a real impact on their identity. Because it was obvious for the participants that they were being targeted simply because that, you know, simply because of their dress, because of their faith, and because they were identifiably Muslim. So Muslim women face an intersection of oppressions. They face misogyny and sexism, both from within and from without their own sort of communities. They face racism and they face Islamophobia. And although Islamophobia is gendered, and there is now research to support that it's gendered, what we find is that in the sort of mainstream sort of feminist movement, it's not an issue that's often taken up by mainstream feminists. And I just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the women that I've worked with over the last sort of however many years I've been working as a grassroots activist, and I've noticed a difference anecdotally, but I've noticed a difference in the last sort of year or so where women, Muslim women that I work with, sort of tell me that they're fearful of going to an event like this, because they wear a jilbab and they're scared of being attacked. The increase in the number of violent terrorist attacks that we've seen in the UK this year have contributed to that. And then after each terrorist attack, there's always sort of a spike in hate crime. Women are sort of telling me that they're fearful of, applying for a job or, trying to further their career. And they are feeling sort of isolated, and it is having sort of impact on their own self-esteem and confidence. And finally, I just kind of wanted to touch on the fact that although we're seeing this impact, this sort of real psychological impact on the mental health of Muslim women and their well-being, when women do go and try and get help, often they are sort of pathologized by mainstream services. So, for example, one woman said that she was told that if she stopped wearing the hijab, then she wouldn't have to worry about being attacked on the street or being targeted or abused. That's not a solution. That's not the type of response somebody who's suffering with anxiety should receive from their GP or anywhere. And often, as in Sophie's case, the sort of the intervention that is needed, the help that's needed, is not getting to the young person or the woman at the right time. It's coming much more at sort of crisis point. And then, sort of more broadly and generally, in my experience, I found that for certain disorders, there is a sort of underdiagnosis when it comes to Muslim women. So a kind of assumption that because you're Asian, Muslim, whatever, you're basically not going to suffer with this illness. So, for example, anorexia is an illness that's, seen to be very much a white illness, whereas actually, there are people from other ethnic minorities who are also dealing with that illness. I just sort of want to say that I've spoken about my sort of experiences of working with Muslim women, and I work predominantly with Muslim women who come from a South Asian heritage, so I can't say that I am speaking for all Muslim women, and I've sort of focused very much on the negative, but Muslim women are very, very different to the stereotype that you see in the media. Empowered, well-educated, very strong, resilient, and very, very diverse and not homogenous at all. And I'm very inspired by the women that I work with. Even though they face so many barriers, they still achieve, many, many things every day, but we just don't get to hear about it. And I look forward to the point where, we don't just talk about Nadia Hussain, who won the Great British Bake Off. I mean, that was brilliant and it was amazing. But, there are so many other talented Muslim women out there, and, I look forward to the point where we see them in their own right, and they're discussed because of their achievements, not because of their potential to be a threat or because they're, oppressed or suffering some sort of, social or, challenge. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Akeela, for such a good talk. So now we're having Ayesha Ahmed. So you can come up if you want. So Ayesha Ahmed is a lecturer in medical ethics and law at St. George's University of London, an honorary lecturer at IGH, where she co-leads a module on conflict, health, and humanitarianism. She is currently a co-researcher on a UCL-funded project on investigating trauma therapeutic interventions using traditional storytelling in Afghanistan, and a consultant on a gender-based violence prevention project based in Mumbai, India. She also provides expert witness reports on refugee and asylum seeker immigration cases. So please welcome Ayesha Ahmed. Yeah.
Okay, good evening. We're going to go a little bit further than the UK. We're going to go to Afghanistan for this talk. First of all, I want to acknowledge my co-researchers, Leah, who's in Afghanistan, and Jean-Pierre, who we've been working for quite a while now on a trauma intervention project related to gender-based violence in Afghanistan. So today I'm going to talk more about some of the mental health aspects, some of the political aspects around mental health that has developed from the research that we've been doing, and some of the questions that I think are crucial to be faced around mental health as it's being developed in Afghanistan in the particular context that I'm going to describe during this talk. You'll see the phrase that I've used for the title of the talk. I'll explain in the some of the outline of the therapeutic intervention that we've been developing around traditional storytelling and what that means. But I think it's really, I like this phrase a lot, even though it's very tragic and poignant. I think it captures the importance of narrative and stories in this particular context, and the association with stories of suffering. What I'm particularly concerned about is the way that these stories of suffering are becoming interpreted. So in some of my wider work, I actually look at some of the dominant narratives that I have to work against, first of all, to deconstruct some of, similar to the previous talk we just heard, about the perception of Afghan women who are victims of violence, first of all. But now what I'm going to talk more about in this talk is the way that stories of suffering are being interpreted in a way that continues to systematically perpetuate violence on a structural level in the Afghan society context, and some of the reasons why that is being undertaken. So just to outline some of the context, so gender-based violence, we know it's a global health issue, but it's a chronic problem in Afghanistan. It's a conflict setting with many forms of conflict, armed conflict, but also other challenges within the society that are in conflict at the moment, including around gender equality. So there's a double burden of psychological trauma, both from the surrounding context and within the home. Particularly as well, because the home, those of you who are familiar with conflict settings, know that the home symbolizes a place of safety, that when there's destruction or bombs outside, that the home should be a sanctuary. So the double meaning of when this does not occur. And a society where gender roles are strictly prescribed, so both genders become vulnerable to gender-based violence. In this talk I'm focusing on women, but there's also work that I'm undertaking on gender-based violence towards men and boys as well. So there's just some statistics around the extent of different forms of gender-based violence and the prevalence amongst Afghan women. And what we are working on particularly is psychological trauma that's related to gender-based violence. So it's interesting how there's actually very little focus on mental health responses to gender-based violence, particularly in a society where mental health infrastructure is developing and where there's very poor infrastructure as well. So I'm going to mention about that in a moment as well. So some context around mental health. Again, it shares a universal stigma around mental health, different forms of taboos prevalent in the society in terms of how mental health is interpreted, or the language that's used around mental health, particularly interpreted in terms of the supernatural, in terms of spirits. But there's been cases where women have been taken to religious leaders who have who have diagnosed them as being possessed by a spirit, and who are prescribed beatings as a way to cure the individual of the spirit. Some of those women have been killed in the process because of this as well. So this is a challenge as well on how to, for me working in global health, it's sometimes very difficult to, when you're trying to work with a particular government, for them to criticize or challenge some of the role of religious leaders in perpetuating this violence as well. It's a chronic form of violence. We know there's been decades of conflict with transgenerational trauma other related traumas such as separation of families, particularly women who get left behind when their sons have to leave the country for various reasons. Health inequalities, including who is able to access care, particular gendered barriers to who might be taken to a doctor if economic situation is poor, then various members of the family might be prioritized. So mental health, because the situation is very scarce in terms of mental health infrastructure and resources, psychiatrists are few and far between. I have colleagues there who are medical doctors who want to work in mental health, but they face many obstacles to do so. And the suffering is gendered. We saw the phrase earlier on and how this is typically used towards women. And I'm going to describe more around the gendered nature of suffering, particularly in terms of the interpretation of mental illness or in terms of the suffering. So this is a case study. It was actually a case that was discussed in some of the local media last year in Afghanistan, so it's not revealing any confidential information. But it's a case of a young woman who was from a farming family, and she had been kidnapped and a victim of sexual violence by an authority member. She, on disclosing the violence to her family, she received support, which in some of her, compared to other cases, this was quite unusual. So she disclosed, she was taken to the police where she was disclosed, and then she was attacked again. And then she was taken to a refuge because of threats against her life. But the point I want to make here is that she made a statement, a very clear statement, that if she did not receive justice for the suffering that she had endured, she was going to set herself alight and consequently die as a result of that, as a form of protest. So the question that I'm asking here in my research and I'm exploring is whether this is a threat, how to interpret this threat of suicide. Is it symptomatic of a mental illness? Is she actually suicidal? Or is she in a context where a woman's narrative is extremely oppressed, where there's very, very little space for someone to have any narrative because of the emotion that the narrative identifies and symbolizes, that this is the only form of agency she can have, albeit a very tragic and obviously a form of agency that we want to try and find alternatives for. But how should this be interpreted? Particularly in a case for a woman who has very little choice over her life as it is. Other areas where mental health is related to gender-based violence, we know that there's cultural customs that actually become very problematic in terms of the way that they interpret it as well. Often these cultural customs are interpreted as, well, it's part of the culture, but that culture is not examined in terms of other determinants of what gives rise, what fuels those cultural customs, in terms of conflict, in terms of economic situations. But we know that even now, when there are interventions and legislations against child marriage and trying to prohibit certain cultural customs such as bad, which is the exchange of brides, usually a very young girl, to a much older man, the mental health issues that are related in terms of trauma related to that, as well as depression, anxiety, etc. And also the imprisonment of women because of trying to make choices about their lives, also risks of other forms of honor-related violence and killings as well. So we found that disclosures of violence cannot be interpreted by as rendering the woman to be crazy, that she is blamed, and that she is silenced. So these systematic structures actually perpetuate other forms of violence and create more context of experiencing trauma and suffering as well. So I mentioned self-immolation a moment ago. So there's a link here to a news article that I wrote a couple of weeks ago, and it was published as an opinion piece in Tolo News, which is one of the, it's published in English, Pashto and Dari, whoever's interested in either of those languages. But in that article, I try to argue that the high rates of self-immolation, Afghanistan is one of the few countries, if not the only country in the world where women outnumber men in terms of who commit suicide, and committing suicide by self-immolation. So in the article, I try to argue that this needs to be interpreted outside of the spectrum of mental illness. But the governmental perspective that women are committing suicide because they are depressed is being used as a tool to actually suppress women further and to continue the violence against women. So by that I mean that there's no one there to diagnose depression, but the view is given on a national level that is depression that is the reason why so many women are setting themselves alight. So there's a line that I wrote in my article, that Afghan women would not be setting themselves alight unless the pain she has inside is more than the pain of flames. So I call for a greater exploration about why this suffering is leading to self-immolation, and the call to bring more attention to an agency and responsibility and accountability against the perpetrators of the violence, rather than rendering the women as committing suicide as a form of depression which is outside of these external influences. So that link is there in case it's of interest. So I'll just explain a little bit about the other side of mental health related to what I've been doing. So on one side, I've been looking at the way that mental health in a context like Afghanistan, where there's pressure to develop a health system at this stage of, I mean, it's debatable if it's conflict or post-conflict, but we know that mental health infrastructure needs to be developed as part of the health system. So if you're thinking about global mental health and the terminology that's being used, it's really interesting to see how that is actually being used to create harm rather than to try to bridge treatment gaps and try to be a form of treatment for those who need it, particularly in a country where as I mentioned earlier, where there's highly traumatized individuals. But the other side of the coin around mental health is where violence creates mental health suffering, mental health trauma. So the way that we've been looking at developing a trauma therapeutic intervention is in trying to use an approach that has meaning within the cultural context. So we conducted life narrative interviews with women who have experienced gender-based violence. And in these interviews, we didn't ask, what is your violence? One of the dominant narratives we're trying to overcome is that women are the stories of their violence. We are trying to create spaces where stories can hold their identity. So we ask questions such as, what poem or song or story can you remember when you were a childhood? And the analysis that we've been doing is extremely rich. We had so much details about those individuals' life that has a very tragic tales of violence, but broaden more in terms of when you read those answers, you can see the way that that woman's experienced and viewed the world from her personal point of view. And we conducted a structured storytelling activity using various medium, which included some of the Persian poetry of women poets who were symbolic in contemporary times and also in historical times, particularly the female poet whose name always escapes me, I can find it, who's alleged to, who when she was imprisoned because of who she fell in love with and she wasn't permitted to marry, her brother slit her jugular vein, and as she lay dying, she used her blood to write poetry on the wall where she was in the room where she died. It's a very gruesome story, but it's very symbolic in this context. We used some of the media articles of the murder of Fakunda just over 2 years ago. So different forms of narrative that we use as a way to relate their own story to. And this is also symbolic. When we're trying to address gender-based violence and associated mental health trauma, we need to look at the sources of the symptoms, which is in the structural roots of the violence within the society. And in this sense, it's going to be futile just to address the individual. We need to address the wider context. So in this sense that the stories, various forms of storytelling that we used have a symbolic value within the society in relation to social transformation. It creates this narrative-based space which symbolizes post-conflict social transformation, given that part of the systematic strategies of the conflict during the Taliban regime were to ban women from reciting poetry. Even now there are underground, if that's the right word, writing organizations where women can go to and write their poetry. There's the Afghan Women Writing Project, AWWP, which is an online forum where women send in their poems or their stories because of the oppression to be able to do this and the therapeutic aspect that it does have in order to do so. So in terms of looking at the theoretical frameworks that we use, our premises are that stories are an integral part of ourself and the meaning that we ascribe to the world around us. So almost the antidote of trauma, which is the annihilation of our worldview. As I mentioned here, trauma challenges our self of the self and the way that we view our surrounding world. So it becomes really important in this context where narratives, individual narratives, where identity is not permitted, that it can, that what these narratives can actually, and stories can symbolize. And these individuals who suffer trauma are faced with having to find new stories, new words, new languages, new concepts, hopefully new proverbs that are, overcoming some of the tragedy of stories make you become from a sorrow you become a storyteller, looking at other forms of stories that we can create. So just a few points there, perhaps as we come to the end. I think I mentioned most of those, but looking at trying to think about, in this case, not just how we interpret suffering from a mental health paradigm, but how do we interpret a trauma response in a society where there's very few mental health resources and where mental health is extremely stigmatized and can lead to greater vulnerabilities of violence as well. Some of the security that we had to think of with this research was that it is a mental health intervention, which adds a double risk and even more stigma on women who've experienced violence as well. And how we can create alternative discourses in this way about particularly around stories of silence. How has this silence been interpreted globally? We try to work with that. There's a big difference between being silent and being silenced, and we need to now, if we're creating this space of using trauma therapeutic intervention based on storytelling, what would a narrative look like in a context of oppression of speech and gender-based violence? How is that narrative going to change? What does it mean to tell a story? So these are some of the questions that we explored in the interviews that we conducted, to explore different meanings of suffering, to try to overcome some of the medicalization of suffering and to challenge some of the dominant interpretations of suffering that are being held in the society that render women even more silent, and exploring why stories are told. So many of the women said in the interviews that they told stories because they wanted to help other women, but they also told stories. They use a particular word frequently in Dari called subik, which is an expression of how to make oneself lighter, this feeling of becoming empty. So this is some of the themes that we explored when we were analysing. So there is a challenge overall for women, Afghan women, to transcend barriers that structure suffering and in turn the medicalised response to trauma. And this is particularly highlighted in a case where there might be political reasons for claiming that women are mentally ill when they are disclosing violence, and when they are coming under the global international view of that there's that there might be a suicide epidemic in the country, and how that might be explained. So if you're thinking about the context of Afghanistan, how women are living in one of the most hostile societies for gender equality, but the creation of stories is part of self-identity. So in this sense, I think it's really important to see that stories are not symptoms, that they can be a mode and a medium for carrying hope, determination, and their identity. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayesha, for such a wonderful talk. I just wanted to reiterate, so we have a Slido. Wait, let me put the, Slido, and we will only be answering questions from this. So if you do want to ask a question, please put it up here, and we'll be answering questions at the end. So our next speaker is Leah Francis. So Leah Francis graduated from psychology at UCL and has just completed a master's in transcultural mental health care at Queen Mary University of London. She's a committee member of the Black and Minority Ethnic Students Network, and she's a former welfare and international sabbatical officer here at UCL, at UCL Student Union, and was part of the Black Students Campaign Committee. She's also organized a conference on mental health in the diaspora and co-organized the Save Kaleshi campaign on asylum seekers with mental health issues, and was one of the co-founders of the Why Is My Curriculum White project. So please welcome Leah. You can just hold it, I think. Yeah.
Hi. So I wasn't really sure what to talk about today because I guess you heard that there's a lot maybe that I could talk about. And so I thought I might talk about something which is kind of closer to my heart, and that is the thesis that I just completed, which is on the impact of being a black, white, mixed race person, the psychological impact. And so I have some notes as well, so sort of bear with me. I think that what Ayesha was just saying about sort of social and cultural factors influencing the perception of mental illness is really, really important, and they influence what it is that function is and what it is that dysfunction is. And in our society, if you're from an African or a Caribbean background, then you're more likely to be diagnosed with severe schizophrenia, and you're more likely to be admitted to hospital for that. You're more likely to face a more coercive pathway into care, and the way in which you'll enter the mental health system is different to other backgrounds. So it's more forceful. You're more likely to have higher levels of medication, and there are lots of differences. So I did my thesis. Looking at black, white, mixed race because I was wondering whether or not there was any specific difference between black, white, mixed race groups and other mixed race groups, because we're usually sort of put into a group together, but also whether there are any differences between black groups and this specific group and white groups and this specific group, specifically because the black group and the white group are kind of the group with the most social distance, and I say that kind of in inverted commas between them, but in terms of outcomes and deprivation levels and experiencing structural inequalities, they're the two groups with this huge amount of difference. So I was quite interested in what the outcomes are and what the research says on that. So I did a systematic review, which meant that I was essentially looking at the trends in the literature. So I looked at all of the literature that exists on it, which is not that much, sadly, despite the fact that there are quite a lot of people that are mixed race. I think I identified 22 eligible papers, and this was including papers all across the world. America, UK, South Africa, there were papers from lots of different countries. I think it's interesting as well because of the concept of race and the idea of the understanding we now have of race as a social construct. So looking at the sort of terminology behind race, people say that it is essentially a crude visual appraisal of appearances related to skin colour, size and form. And genetic testing and biological evidence has scientifically brought biological theories of race into disrepute, which is interesting because a lot of the scientific theories about race actually came from UCL. If you look at the Why is My Curriculum White campaign, it tells you a little bit more about the history of eugenics and pseudoscience that was sort of behind that. I'm not going to go into that now. And the UN actually proposed formally eliminating the term race, replacing it with ethnic group, but socially race has remained, and social scientists use it still because although it has been put into disrepute as a biological or genetic phenomenon, there's not very much difference genetically between different racial groups. The differences within racial groups are larger than the differences between so-called racial groups. The social construction and the cultural relevance of the notion still remains. So, for example, if you are a black person in Nigeria, your likelihood of being diagnosed with schizophrenia is more similar to a white person in the UK than a black person in the UK. So social and cultural factors affect mental health, and it's really important that we recognise that. And so that's why race is still quite important in scientific research, and it's important that we look at it, but also that we're critiquing it and acknowledging that the differences are predominantly to do with group identity, power differences, and social prescriptions. So there are a few theories around mixed race, black-white outcomes, and how that could influence on you. And going back quite far, people used to call people of this background hybrids, and it was thought that maybe you would be sterile, and the term mulatto, which some of you might have heard, comes from the word mule, and a mule is the infertile offspring of a horse and a donkey, and it's that kind of idea that it's not something that can be an actual person. And then people thought that maybe multiracial people would just be innately psychologically dysfunctional. And this is a theory which was existing essentially to discourage racial blending, but also to protect and preserve white racial purity and dominance. So again, it's kind of reflecting the socio-political context within which this theory was developed, and also reflecting the pseudoscientific theories and the way in which they dominate. More recent perspectives look at the idea of reconciling conflicts caused by identity, and whether or not it's important to develop a healthy monoracial sense of self. So potentially, if you're like me and you're mixed race with a parent who's black and a parent who's white, I might identify as only black or only white. And some people say that that's necessary in order to be psychologically healthy. Other people have said that it's important to incorporate dual racial identities into a coherent and stable multiracial identification. But then other people have also said that, and I think this is the one I kind of like best, that your self-identification is non-linear, without a single endpoint, and it's contextually shifting. So depending on who you're with and where you are, you might identify differently. So my research essentially found that people who were of a black and white mixed race group were at a higher risk compared to white monoracial groups for depression, but less so than black monoracial groups. Pathological eating behaviour, so eating disorders, wasn't really studied particularly widely, but where it was studied was on a Caribbean island, and they found that it was not seen in the black majority, but it was seen in some white people and also black white mixed race people who attempted to sort of distance themselves from the black majority, which was interesting as well. Negative behavioural outcomes included were equivalent to the negative outcomes of monoracial groups, or they were worse than both. So that kind of suggested that there was an overall risk associated with being mixed race. It's important to note that when I say there's a risk, this isn't something that's innate within the individual. This is to do with the way in which the individual is functioning within society. So there's something within the social context that is encouraging, which is creating that risk. Sociability, which I found interesting, was found to be comparable or better than monoracial groups for all mixed race groups, apart from the Asian and black group. And also perceptions of friendships were poorer for mixed race black white people, although the reality was equivalent. So although they had equivalent levels of friendships and quality of friendships, they didn't perceive them as particularly as beneficial as other people did, or as good quality. So mediating variables is where I was really looking at gender as well. And interestingly, a lot of the research that looked at gender was conducted in adolescence. So I think that I considered adolescence up to the age of 24. So that would probably cover a lot of people here, looking at the room. And it was interesting looking at the need to, the importance of identity, but also the differences that were seen according to gender. And in terms of outcomes, social well-being was something which was particularly emphasized during adolescence. And peer evaluation, so how your friends see you, was also particularly significant, but also in terms of self-identification, determining the racial identity of these individuals. So whether or not I saw myself as a black person, a white person, a mixed race person, or just a human being with no racial affiliation, might be determined by the people around me as opposed to myself. And distress and invalidation and was found to come from that, as well as experiences of prejudice and racism. So research sort of talking about people's experiences was really useful in understanding that. The experiences of gender and sexuality also mediated the experiences of being racially appraised, and they were as diverse. They affected it as diversely as things like class, ability, and location. Disparities for depression in a study in Brazil were largely accounted for by gender differences as well as social class, which was really interesting. But also, again, context is really important, and the Brazilian mixed race people had very similar outcomes to the Brazilian black people, and that potentially says something about the way in which race is constructed in Brazil, and this idea of a multicultural society and whether or not that actually exists in reality, which I thought was also really interesting. also, the UK was kind of absent from data. There wasn't very much, which I thought was interesting. And where it was there, it was looking specifically at experiences of discrimination, which makes sense when you look at the history of the UK and you consider discrimination and how that's brought up race within mental health services, such as the case of David Rocky Bennett, which was a man with schizophrenia who was killed in custody in psychiatric care, in fact, and had experienced a lot of racism. And that was sort of the first big jolt that got the UK and the NHS to really examine race and mental health and how the two interlink. But yeah, I think it's interesting that the UK doesn't really look at it properly, apart from discrimination, because the research suggests that it goes much further than discrimination. It can influence your depression, your self-evaluation, your self-esteem, anxiety, and self-concept, and so many different outcomes that I think that much more research is needed in the area, and especially given the huge amount of mixed race people that there are, and the fact that it's the fastest growing population in the world, in the country, in fact. I don't know about the world. We definitely need to have more research in the area. And implications-wise, it would be really, really useful for supporting therapy for people who are having potentially identity issues, but also for considering the ways in which our social context might be putting people at risk. Yeah, I think that is everything that I want to say on it. What's my time like? One more thing is, it's not in my research, but I did also read a really interesting paper which was looking at schizophrenia and the rates of schizophrenia in black and ethnic minority groups, and also mixed race groups. And it found gender differences, found that mixed race women were at the highest risk for affective psychosis. And this also kind of reflected the fact that your risk of schizophrenia or psychosis increases with each generation. So the idea that that schizophrenia might just be because you've come over from the Caribbean or from Africa isn't necessarily true, because we actually see the risk increasing for each new set of families, each generation in the country. So again, it's about looking at what the factors are that are promoting it. Is it geographical? Is it microaggressions? There are so many potential different variables, and that could be a talk in itself, which I'm not going to do. Yeah. Oh, and also another quick point is when you were talking about religion earlier, I just also wanted to make a point of that religion also has a protective effect. So although obviously we're living in a horrible society where Islamophobia is awful, being religious can also be protective for mental illness. So it's a good thing as well. I just thought I would bring that up.
So thank you so much, Leah, for that really fascinating talk. We will now be doing questions. So we only have time for a few questions. So we'll select some. But yeah, just give us 2 minutes while we set up.
Yeah, pretty much. And like, I mean, I don't know if they're anyone. I don't know if they're the kind of people who do stupid shit. No, but like, there is that kind of. It's very sensitive, like the pictures and the cool people. It's like. Did you get it now?
The article is in the
And I
comments
think
of
it
the
makes
Facebook
sense
Live.
that it's like these people. They are so careful about they, you know, their look, the kind of person. I believe about that. I think it's
in the perfect representation of, like, you know, the divergence of our lives. You can go to and I'll stand outside of the mall with a cigarette. You know, I'm on a different course, I don't know, but
I just unlocked that evening. I was like, I literally don't know what to say. Because it's not interesting. Like, I know it sounds really bad.
they exist by industry. Most active groups like first of all, energies will be. I've been like galvanized by, yeah, exactly. You know, you still have this like genuine belief that you're gonna like make things in place, which is good for you. I want to start a revolution. That's like I'm with you. Let's go. But I did go through a bit of service stuff. I know, right?
Where you've met them several times. Or even like, even if it's just one time. And it's just
I
a
think
joke.
it's like not cynicism, like straight up yeah, which is worse than cynicism.
And you can tell that that person doesn't really.
I wish the Egyptian
Yeah, you know.
would be.
Yeah, well,
I've met them. It's all like it's all not like
I try to like give people the politics and just like the history lessons, like these things never work.
It's going to stay the time.
So I only had to like wait a few years to get my like
the guy who was
right. I wish I had.
like, I was going on that nice. Like, it's a government, which is fine. Maybe it's just because
In Hungary it's weird.
they like having like a little bit. That's a lot of effort. So maybe you go back to there, but then it's straight out there. It's one day, tomorrow.
Okay. So, as I said, we don't have necessarily that much time, so we're going to only ask a few questions. So our first question is, what are the trends in mental health problem prevalence / incidence among internally displaced people and refugees? What is being done in the UK to help? Who wants to?
I need to think about it. Can you say the question? Sorry? Is it?
Yeah. So what are the trends in mental health problem prevalence / incidence among internally displaced people and refugees, and what is being done in the UK to help?
Yeah, that's why I'm hesitating. Do I need to say the question again? No. Okay. Okay. So I'll just talk a little bit from the work that I've been doing, and we know that that's an area that's under-researched. We know that there are many factors that are influencing mental health of those who are internally displaced, and then those who might migrate from those contexts and claim asylum in other countries as refugees. In the cases I work in, I can see from the transcripts and the case reports that I'm analysing when I'm providing reports to support asylum claims that the impact of trauma is often misinterpreted from outside of the mental health field, particularly on why trauma narratives are not consistent that's often interpreted as with disbelief and that it didn't occur, because there's a common belief that someone who has experienced trauma, such as torture or witnessed violence events, are going to remember the incidents detail by detail. But that's not the case, because of the way that trauma impacts on memory and on the psychological state of the person. In the UK, I think there are mental health of refugees and asylum seekers is being addressed, but access and some of the barriers are significant, because especially for individuals who are waiting a long time for their asylum claims to be processed, often have to go for various stages of appeal, have to go for invasive psychological assessments for the purpose of a legal report, and some of the ethical issues in starting somebody to start on long-term trauma-focused therapy when you don't know how long that person is going to be able to be in the UK for, and possibly being returned to a country where there is no available mental health infrastructure. So I would say a mixture of factors. Do you want to?
Thanks. So next question is, wait, sorry, let me find it. Could we have a definition of mental health and its opposition to physical health, as we seem to be defining mental health by its absence of disease? Do you want to answer?
Do you want to go?
I think that it's not always helpful to completely separate mental health and physical health. I just want to say for one thing, because the two can be interconnected sometimes with things like chronic pain, your sort of mental well-being can impact on your physical state, and also when you're experiencing mental illness, that can also affect your physical well-being. So I don't know that it's necessarily helpful to always separate them like that. And actually defining mental health is something that a lot of people struggle with. I would say that it's like the absence of distress that like really impacts on your ability to function in society and to do your everyday activities, of significant distress, I might add. But other people would have different ways of looking at it. And the conference I did earlier this year specifically didn't use the term mental health as its main term, and we used distress because it's not something that everyone can identify with. Not everyone necessarily thinks of it as being sort of mentally or within their mind. Some people feel it physically, and other people will describe it quite differently. So mental health is also quite a Western term as well. It's something that is very much used in Western countries. So I also, again, I'm not really that keen on always using it as a way of describing the sort of ideal. Yeah, I think I'm going to finish on that.
Okay, I don't know where to. Okay, so I'll just add to that as well, particularly in the context where I work in. I use mental health in a way because there's some pressures in terms of having to conform to language that is going to be used that can be understood in the context I'm working in. There's always a tension there, particularly when mental health doesn't translate well at all into the context where I'm working in, where it's not accepted, where it's some of my colleagues in Afghanistan who've worked on having to call particular interventions that have been funded by international organizations, international governments, gender equality or mental health, that they've been attacked because of that, because of the stigma and westernization that associated with. So I think that there's lots of problems with using mental health, but I think it's going to be different in different places. To give more of a positive term rather than think about it in terms of absence, I would think in where I'm working in, it would be a way to be able to hold and express your own narrative and identity in a free way, which means without experiencing fear of violence.
Thanks. So this question has been upvoted a lot, so a lot of you are keen on hearing it. So it's, do you think biomarker tests could be used practically in the field of mental health in order to assess patients' mental health or mental state? Yeah.
It's not really my area, but I mean, what I would say is that, you know, mental illness or poor mental health, you know, has many sort of causes and contributing factors which are not physical. You know, there are psychological, there are social factors, and in my sort of area of work, you know, social factors and social context, you know, childhood, upbringing, those contribute more, you know, environment contributes more to a person's sort of mental well-being than any sort of, you know, biological factors. Yes, biological factors can cause predispositions or vulnerabilities. So, you know, I've always been very wary of trying to kind of just take a sort of medicalized and biological approach to mental health, and, you know, using biometric markers? Oh, biomarkers? You know, for me, I'm instinctively wary of it, basically. And I think, you know, there's a risk then that you're just labeling and diagnosing people who actually probably are functioning and, you know, don't need to have any kind of intervention. So I would sort of really sort of strongly go against it, if my understanding of it is correct.
I think there's such a wide range of distress or suffering that we're talking about when we're referring to mental health as well. But in the areas of trauma, I think I would be wary of some of the political reasons for using biomarkers, as opposed to understanding some of the environmental causes. So if we look at the literature on psychological impact of various aspects of conflict, you will rarely see the impact of civilians. In some of the work I've done on the psychological impact of drones, most of the research, probably actually 100% of the research, has been on the drone operators and the psychological impact on them on operating drones rather than on the civilians. So I think there might be political reasons for not wanting to understand other causal factors of trauma.
Okay, so our next question is, often women who are experiencing abuse may experience gaslighting or may internalize the abuse they are experiencing. How can this impact their mental health?
What was the first gaslighting?
So it was often women who are experiencing abuse may experience gaslighting.
Oh, yeah, okay. I think, again, that is influenced greatly by the society around you, and sorry to keep referring to the work that I'm doing, but the disbelief around disclosures of violence, even though it's so prevalent, is extremely powerful, and disbelief in the sense of who is the perpetrator and who is the victim. So in the structures where I'm working in, it's extremely punitive towards the victim. A woman who's been a victim of sexual violence can be imprisoned because if it's because of crimes such as zina, which is sexual relations outside of marriage. So when you're in an environment like this, there needs to be somebody has to resist a lot those internal structures of silencing and gaslighting as well. Again, in extreme settings where violence is normalized and as socially accepted cultural norms. I mentioned some of the security or issues around the research that I did. There is much less stigma or risk around research on violence against women than there is with mental health. That's because there's no shame in a perpetrator committing violence to a woman in that context. So I think it really those factors, I think, they originate because of the society around us. And I think with what's happening in the UK at the moment with the discourses, we can see those attitudes as also prevalent here as well.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything you said, and in the context of that I work in with sort of ethnic minorities and young Muslim women, and the women I've worked with who've experienced, for example, child sex abuse, they've said that when they sort of told their parent or family member or whoever about the abuse they had experienced or were experiencing, and then there was, you know, sort of a denial or complete or sort of victim blaming, sort of being told that it was somehow their fault, that has and then the disbelief as well, that has been like another trauma for them, which was even worse than the actual sort of abuse, and it's deeply, you know, affected them, and some of them have said that that in itself made them think about suicide and self-harm as opposed to the kind of the abuse they suffered in the first instance.
Okay, so our next question is, can diagnostic standards change to reflect potential racial or cultural biases of the medical professionals?
So diagnostic standards is an interesting question, because when you consider the history of racism in diagnostic standards, there was this guy called Metzel who wrote a book called The Protest Psychosis, and this book was essentially revealing that the DSM, which is the diagnostic manual that's used in America, but is also used like very widely in research, the criteria were kind of changing to target civil rights protesters during the time of civil rights. So although we kind of like to think about the diagnostic criteria that are being used as very apolitical and scientific, the people that are they're being written by people. People are influenced by society, by politics, and in the same way as other narratives, diagnostic standards can also be influenced by that, and that can have really, really powerful consequences, such as forcibly committing civil rights protesters by saying you're showing aggression and you're showing paranoia because you think that the police are after you, which might be perfectly reasonable, but was being used as another form of control. At this moment, the diagnostic criteria are quite also heavily influenced by the psychopharmacological industry, and so that's the drug industry. And in some ways, the drug industry is largely influencing what is considered a symptom of mental health. So maybe you might have heard about the idea of serotonin levels and depression. This theory kind of came from drug evidence, as opposed to evidence looking at serotonin levels specifically. So it was a result of the drug evidence, and it's also where the money is at. The drug industry has a lot of money and funds the research, which then influences the diagnostic standards. So they can change with regards to looking at racism and looking at cultural standards and considering them. And the diagnostic material does mention considering, I think, cultural context, and it has a specific cultural disorders section as well. But also the diagnostic materials are very, very influenced by where the money is and where the power is. And so I guess it depends on whether the anti-racists and the cultural proponents have the money and the power as to whether or not we'll see much change, in my opinion.
Okay, so our next question is, how can gendered language and mental health be beneficial to women and conversely detrimental?
That's a good question, but clever question, but difficult. I think my answer would be the framework or the lens in which the suffering is viewed from a gender perspective will contribute to understanding the experiences of the mental health, if it's depression or anxiety or trauma related to this context of violence. The link between gender-based violence and mental health is very loose, it's very under-researched, and I think perhaps this is because some of the resistance to using a gendered language in the context of a biomedical framework of understanding suffering. So I think being able to balance whether it's can be useful or whether it can be detrimental is going to depend on how robust and how established that framework is when you're analysing the context of mental health, particularly again, thinking about trauma in a context where gender roles are highly prescribed. What are some of the end goals? What are some of the objectives that can be achieved? And also, if we are thinking in this context of women who are experiencing suffering because of gender equality, some of the consequences on the other side of the spectrum as well, not to consider it as binary, but to think about violence occurring across all forms of gender and how this can be viewed.
Just choosing a question. So, how has austerity impacted mental health in the UK?
So there is evidence which links austerity to worsening mental health. So broadly speaking, austerity is not beneficial, unsurprisingly, to your mental health. But it also, I think, it acts on different levels because it is affecting our NHS, for example. So it's affecting waiting list times and ability to get into services. The politics of it as well, I think, are kind of presenting this. It's quite a masculine. People need to be looking after themselves, and people deserve what they get. If you work hard, you'll get. You won't need to worry about money so much. This sort of myth of meritocracy, which a lot of people kind of understand isn't necessarily true, because we know that there is systematic bias. There is a gender pay gap, which increases if you also account for race. You're less likely to get into universities if you're a person of colour as well, and there are these systems in place which stop you from reaching this kind of ideal person, or this sort of the thing that we're supposed to be striving for, that the austerity state suggests that we can be if we try hard enough. I feel like I kind of diverted a little bit away from it. But also poverty is very much interacts with race and gender as well. Yeah.
Just to add to that, I work in homelessness, and since 2010 I've definitely seen an increase in a number of people who are street homeless and rough sleeping. And these are not the sort of people who've been on the streets for years and years and having an enduring mental illnesses and prefer to be on the streets or what have you. They are people they've had they've lost their job, and then they've lost their house, and then they've ended up on the street, and they've had other sort of social problems. And then added to that, I've also seen that people who are dealing with severe and enduring mental illnesses, who are dealing with very difficult social challenges, who are very hard to reach, the services, the mental health services, just don't have the same sort of resources and capacity to deal with those types of people, and they're just kind of getting sort of left alone, or it's easier for them to be kind of hospitalized and medicated than to be cared for in the community, or to just be kind of left to fend for themselves. And then I've also seen that actually people who are homeless and are sort of receiving some sort of intervention, in terms of trying to get them off the streets, they should be also simultaneously receiving mental health interventions, but they're not receiving those. They're kind of just going on waiting lists, or their name gets referred, but it's kind of going into a kind of an ether, if you like. And obviously there is a kind of variation depending where you are in the country and what have you. If you're in Westminster, you might be treated a bit better than, say, if you're in Brighton. But I think definitely austerity has had an impact on the mental well-being of people in the UK.
Okay, so this next question is, what is culturally sensitive mental health care, and how can healthcare providers do better?
Yeah, there's a lot of terms I use in my work that I really don't like, but I use them. And culturally sensitive is one of them, which I try to avoid using, but it's very difficult to find the right language. So culturally sensitive, I think, if we think about what is culture, everything is culture. The way that we're sitting in this room right now is symptomatic of our culture. So any kind of health treatment or health intervention should be, by virtue of it being treatment and healing, should be culturally sensitive. I think some of the challenges I find in my work about what makes something culturally sensitive that I alluded to earlier is respecting the idea that to be culturally sensitive you have to respect current structures within a society. So respect that religious leaders are culturally important, that they symbolize spirituality, they symbolize goodness because they're religious leaders, that they're gatekeepers to a community, getting access to a community, when in reality this is often not the case. As I mentioned about some of the advice around beatings for spirit possession, some of the perpetuation of violence, and resistance to challenging this, because if you're challenging it, then you're not being culturally sensitive. So these are some of the challenges I face in my work about what actually being culturally sensitive means, and I think our limitation about to be able to be culturally sensitive is coming from a limitation of culture. All of you here, I assume, are studying. If you look at the way that culture is integrated in the education, in medical education, it's very rarely talked about what culture is. Why is culture important? It's often standardized and categorized and added as an appendix. This is so-and-so's culture. In order to be sensitive, we have to conform with that. But in many cases, you're actually colluding with some of the issues you're trying to address. So that's an area, as you can see, that I'm quite frustrated with about what it means to be culturally sensitive. In the work that I do around storytelling, that's using a resource that's present in a society that has positive aspects. It's, if we think about culture, the definition I use, that culture refers to something that can create, that can generate, whereas something that's violence is destructive. So in my work I try to look more around the creative element, so maybe the term creative rather than culturally sensitive is something that I would like to promote further.
In the sort of context that I've been working with sort of Muslims, whilst I was at the Muslim Youth Helpline, we conducted some research around why young Muslims contacted us as opposed to going to the sort of local GP or mental health services. And one of the issues that came back very strongly was that young Muslims felt more comfortable speaking to people who understood their background and their heritage and their culture and their identity. They reported at that time that often when they would go and speak to their GP, and say they were sort of dealing with anxiety and depression because they're in a relationship, for example, their GP sort of wouldn't really understand. For them, it would, they would kind of hear the kind of they'd be stereotyped, basically. They'd sort of hear sort of things like, well, you're young, you're free to do what you want, just go and do what you want. And it kind of didn't take into account any of the complexities of the young person's identity and what was going on for them in the background, and how that then impacted on their mental health, and then that impacted on their experience of accessing mental health, and then also the kind of treatment that they were offered or not offered, because they were told, change your culture and you'll be okay, you won't be depressed anymore. So that's the kind of context in which I work. So I was, a big advocate of culturally and faith-sensitive mental health, and I think, since I was at the Muslim Youth Helpline, actually, services are now, mental health services in certain areas, say Leicester, Bradford, they're much more able to they've done their own research and they've sort of taken on some of that, and they're providing, services which are culturally sensitive, and also organisations like Mind are doing the same. I would add a caveat, which is it's always important, if you're a mental health practitioner, to check with the individual before you make assumptions. So don't make assumptions around somebody's background and identity and stereotype them. And then also, if you see somebody who's Muslim or whatever, don't assume that just because they're wearing a headscarf or they've got a Muslim name that they're going to be religious or think a certain way and have traditional values or whatever the stereotype is, basically. So you've got to check with the individual, and I think that's really important part of providing a culturally sensitive service. And actually, it's an important part of, it's best practice, really, isn't it?
I really like what both of you guys said. I just want to add a tiny bit. I think just also emphasising listening to people's stories and their ideas and their understanding of their symptoms and how they want to be treated and why they feel like they're experiencing these symptoms is really important in culturally competent care. Also, looking into your own implicit biases, your own understanding of other cultures that are different to your own regular culture, and challenging those biases and challenging your understanding, and surrounding yourself with people that have different views to you, and really just constantly evolving and understanding and empathizing with other experiences, I think, is really important to culturally competent care, and also just to being a human being and in a multicultural society. Also, there are a few services that are kind of best practice that we were talking about a little bit before that look at offering sort of culturally competent care. There used to be a lot more, but now I think there's something like 18 because the funding got cut for them. So I think it's really important that we try to protect the services that we do have, which are used as best practice for other services which aren't culturally specific, and support those services and recognise their importance as well. I'm going to end on that.
Okay, so that was our last question. So thank you so much to our speakers for coming. It was really wonderful. Also, I just wanted to give a special thank you to Isaac for live streaming for us. And then if you want to come to similar events and keep updated with what we're doing at UCL Medicine, please go like the Facebook page, UCL Medicine Students for Global Health. And thank you all for coming.